On a barrier island in Palm Beach, Florida, there stands a palace that was never supposed to survive, Mar-a-Lago. The name means sea to lake in Spanish, 17 acres stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth Lagoon, 126 rooms, 36,000 antique tiles, a house so large that the woman who built it needed a staff of 60 just to maintain it. Marjorie Merriweather Post constructed this estate in the 1920s when she was one of the wealthiest women in America. She filled it with treasures from around the world. She hosted presidents, diplomats, and royalty within its walls. She believed it would endure forever as a winter White House, a symbol of American achievement, a gift to the nation. She was wrong. After her death, the property changed hands, changed purpose, and nearly vanished entirely. The government rejected it as too expensive. Buyers walked away. Demolition permits were approved. For a brief moment in 1985, wrecking crews stood ready to reduce Marjorie Post's dream to rubble. That never happened. Instead, something stranger occurred. The estate that no one wanted became one of the most controversial addresses in America. The government retreat that failed became a private club. The legacy Marjorie Post carefully planned collapsed, then transformed into something she never could have imagined. This is not a simple story about architecture or wealth. This is a story about how power changes hands, how legacies fail, and how the same walls can mean entirely different things to different generations. It's about an American aristocrat who tried to give away her palace and a real estate developer who saw opportunity where everyone else saw burden. It's about the gap between what we build for and what actually survives. If you're interested in the hidden stories behind America's most famous estates and how power really works in this country, please consider subscribing. I'd also welcome your thoughts in the comments. Now let's go inside the palace that refused to disappear and discover why it almost did. The woman who built Mar-a-Lago believed in permanence. She believed in legacy. She believed that if you constructed something magnificent enough, filled it with beautiful enough objects, and gave it to the right people, it would last forever. Marjorie Merriweather Post was born into wealth in 1887, but not the kind of wealth that built Mar-a-Lago. That fortune came later, through breakfast cereal and frozen food, through business acumen that transformed her father's company into General Foods, one of the largest corporations in America. By the time she started planning her Palm Beach estate in 1923, Marjorie was 46 years old and had already proven herself in ways few women of her era could. She'd survived her father's suicide, navigated multiple marriages, and built an empire while society still questioned whether women should even control property. She'd also developed very specific ideas about beauty, about permanence, about what America should aspire to become. Palm Beach in the 1920s was already the winter capital of American wealth. Henry Flagler had transformed the barrier island from wilderness into resort destination decades earlier. The Royal Poinciana Hotel attracted industrialists and their families. Mansions lined the lakefront. Worth Avenue glittered with shops that could have been transplanted from Paris or London. But Marjorie wanted something different, something that went beyond a winter cottage, beyond even the grandest estates her peers were building. She wanted to create an American palace that would rival anything in Europe. Not a copy, but something uniquely suited to Florida's landscape and climate while maintaining the sophistication she'd absorbed during years of European travel. She found 17 acres running from ocean to lake. The location was perfect. Solid coral foundation that could support substantial construction. Water on both sides. Views that would never be blocked. The property was expensive, but money was the one thing Marjorie Post never lacked. She hired 2 architects, recognizing that what she envisioned required different kinds of expertise. Marion Sims Wyeth would design the structure itself. He understood Florida construction, knew how to build for hurricanes, how to work with coral and local materials. But Marjorie wanted more than sound engineering. She wanted theater. For that, she turned to Joseph Urban, a Viennese designer who had created sets for the Metropolitan Opera and worked with Florence Ziegfeld. Urban understood spectacle. He knew how to make rooms feel like stage settings, how to combine colors and materials in ways that astonished rather than merely pleased. Together, Wyeth and Urban would create something unprecedented, a house that was structurally sound enough to survive Florida's worst storms while being visually spectacular enough to rival the great Mediterranean villas Marjorie had toured. Construction began in 1924. The site transformed almost overnight into a massive operation. Post authorized whatever workforce was necessary. Hundreds of men arrived from across Florida and beyond. The foundation required dynamite to break through the hardest coral. The walls would rise slowly, carefully, built to last centuries. But here's what made Mar-a-Lago different from almost every other Gilded Age mansion. Marjorie was building in Florida, not Newport where her peers constructed summer cottages. Not New York, where Fifth Avenue palaces announced arrival into society's highest circles. Florida, a place that serious people still considered frontier. The decision was strategic. Marjorie understood that Palm Beach was where America's wealthy gathered during the crucial winter months. This was when deals were made, when marriages were arranged, when social hierarchies were reinforced or challenged. A magnificent winter residence in Florida mattered more than another Newport cottage. She also understood permanence. The Newport cottages and New York mansions were already beginning to fall. Taxes were rising. Staffing was becoming impossible. The economics that made such houses feasible were changing. But Florida was different. The climate was gentler. The lifestyle was less formal. And Marjorie was building not just for herself, but for the nation. From the beginning, Mar-a-Lago was conceived as a future government property. Marjorie spoke openly about her intention to give the estate to the United States after her death. It would become a winter White House, a place where presidents could retreat, where foreign leaders could be entertained, where American power could be displayed in a setting of unmatched beauty. This vision shaped every decision. The scale had to be impressive enough for state functions. The rooms had to accommodate large gatherings. The grounds had to provide both privacy and grandeur. Mar-a-Lago was being built as a public building that happened to be privately owned. The construction took 4 years. During that time, 3 boatloads of Dorian stone arrived from Italy. Marjorie had selected the fossil-bearing limestone specifically because it aged rapidly, developing a patina that made new construction appear established. 36,000 antique Spanish tiles were installed, each one unique, some dating back centuries. Black and white marble arrived from a Cuban castle. Carved wooden beams in the Spanish style supported ceilings throughout. Urban designed interiors that mixed Spanish, Venetian, and Portuguese influences into something that felt both European and subtropical. The living room spanned 1,800 square feet with ceilings reaching over 40 feet. Gold leaf accented decorative elements everywhere. The ballroom could hold hundreds. Each major room had its own character, its own collection of treasures Marjorie had acquired during decades of travel. By the time Mar-a-Lago opened in January 1927, the estate had cost over $7 million. Adjusted for inflation, that represented well over $100 million in modern currency. It was, at the time, reportedly the most expensive private residence ever constructed in the United States. The house Marjorie created was spectacular. 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, a tower offering 360-degree views of ocean and lagoon, service wings large enough to house and feed the staff of 60 required to maintain everything, gardens that rivaled botanical collections, a pier extending into the lake. But Mar-a-Lago was more than architecture and decoration. It was a statement about what America could achieve. While Europe had centuries-old palaces, America had ingenuity and wealth, and the willingness to create something entirely new. Marjorie believed Mar-a-Lago represented the best of American ambition, refined by European sophistication, perfectly adapted to Florida's unique character. For the next 46 years, Mar-a-Lago would function exactly as Marjorie intended. She entertained constantly, presidents visited, foreign dignitaries dined in the Great Hall. The social calendar during season rivaled anything in Newport or New York. The house proved that Florida could host the highest levels of American society. But underneath the success, the economics were already problematic. Mar-a-Lago consumed money at an astonishing rate. Staff salaries, maintenance, utilities, landscaping. The annual costs exceeded $1 million. Even for someone as wealthy as Marjorie Post, this was substantial. And the world was changing. The Depression arrived. World War II transformed American society. The post-war era brought different values, different expectations. The lifestyle Mar-a-Lago represented, with its army of servants and endless entertaining, was becoming not just expensive but anachronistic. Marjorie understood this. She watched other Gilded Age estates fail. She saw mansions demolished, fortunes dispersed, families unable to maintain what their parents had built. She knew Mar-a-Lago faced the same pressures. Her solution was the one she'd planned from the beginning. She would give Mar-a-Lago to the government. The United States would preserve it as a national treasure. Presidents would use it as a winter retreat. The public would benefit from her generosity. Her legacy would be secured. It was a beautiful plan, logical, generous, patriotic. She spent years preparing the gift, working with lawyers to structure the transfer, establishing a trust fund to help offset maintenance costs, ensuring every detail was perfect. What Marjorie didn't anticipate was that no one would want it, the gift that no one wanted. In 1972, Congress approved legislation accepting Mar-a-Lago as a donation to the federal government. President Nixon signed the acceptance. Marjorie Merriweather Post received the recognition she'd sought. The estate would become a winter White House after her death, exactly as she'd planned for nearly 50 years. Then, on September 12, 1973, Marjorie died at age 86. Mar-a-Lago transferred to government ownership. Her will provided a trust fund of $100,000 annually to help with maintenance. Everything was arranged perfectly. The problems started immediately. Nixon had signed the acceptance legislation, but he already owned a Florida retreat. His Key Biscayne compound offered everything he needed. The Watergate scandal was consuming his presidency. He visited Mar-a-Lago once for a brief inspection in 1974. That was his only appearance. Gerald Ford succeeded Nixon in August 1974. Ford preferred Colorado ski slopes to Florida beaches. Mar-a-Lago sat empty through his entire presidency. Jimmy Carter's administration took the prospect seriously. Staff toured the property. Experts evaluated the facility. Security consultants assessed the location. The conclusions were discouraging. The trust fund covered barely 10% of actual operating costs. Taxpayers would need to shoulder at least $900,000 annually. That was just for basic maintenance, not improvements, not the level of upkeep required for a presidential residence. Security presented additional complications. A public road ran near the property. Palm Beach International Airport generated constant aircraft noise. The location offered nothing that Camp David or other existing facilities couldn't provide more efficiently and safely. The practical assessment was unambiguous. Mar-a-Lago made no sense as a presidential retreat. The costs were unjustifiable. The location was problematic. The scale was excessive for actual use. Carter's team recommended returning the property. Congressional debates followed through 1979 and 80. In December 1980, legislation transferred Mar-a-Lago back to the Post Foundation. The government's ownership had lasted 7 years. No president had ever slept there. Marjorie's carefully planned legacy had failed. The winter White House never happened. The gift had been rejected. Everything she'd envisioned for Mar-a-Lago's future collapsed. The Post Foundation now faced the same problems the government had confronted. Operating costs hadn't decreased. The trust fund couldn't cover them. The estate required constant expenditure without generating any income. And the foundation had no interest in maintaining a money pit. The daughters, including actress Dina Merrill, had their own lives. None wanted the responsibility of running Mar-a-Lago. The decision was pragmatic. Put it on the market. Mar-a-Lago was listed at $20 million. The price reflected the property's size, location, and historical significance. For that amount, a buyer would acquire 17 oceanfront acres, a 126-room mansion, gardens, and everything Marjorie had created. Nobody bought it. The house was too large for practical family use. The operating expenses terrified potential buyers. The real estate market in the early 1980s was soft. Several prospective deals developed, then collapsed before closing. Buyers would tour the property, calculate the costs, and walk away. Without adequate maintenance, Mar-a-Lago began to deteriorate. Paint peeled from exterior walls. Gardens grew wild. The landscaping that had been meticulously maintained for decades became overgrown. The house that once hosted presidents sat mostly empty, visited only by caretakers and the occasional prospective buyer who inevitably decided against purchasing. The situation grew desperate. By 1985, the foundation had concluded that Mar-a-Lago would never sell as a residence. The only viable option was demolition. The land was valuable. Developers would pay handsomely for 17 oceanfront acres even if they had to demolish the mansion. The property could be subdivided into smaller lots. Everything Marjorie Post had built would vanish, but at least the foundation could recover some value. Demolition permits were filed. The decision was final. Wrecking crews would arrive within months. This was the moment when Mar-a-Lago should have ended, not with glory, not as a national monument, but as rubble. Another Gilded Age mansion destroyed because economics made preservation impossible. Then a New York real estate developer made a phone call. He'd been watching Mar-a-Lago's declining fortunes with interest. He saw something nobody else could see. Not a burden, not an impossible maintenance nightmare, but opportunity. His name was Donald Trump, and he was about to transform Mar-a-Lago into something Marjorie Post never imagined. Trump's bargain. Donald Trump first noticed Mar-a-Lago while vacationing in Palm Beach in 1982. The sprawling estate caught his attention immediately. He was 39 years old. Trump Tower was under construction in Manhattan. His reputation for ambitious projects was established, but Florida represented new territory. The property appealed to him on multiple levels. The scale was impressive. The location was unmatched. And most importantly, nobody else wanted it. Trump understood that desperation created opportunity. His first offer was $15 million. The Post Foundation rejected it without serious consideration. The asking price reflected decades of investment and irreplaceable craftsmanship. Trump's offer seemed like an insult. Other interested parties continued circling, several signed purchase contracts. But financing repeatedly fell through. Inspections revealed expensive repairs. Each potential deal collapsed before closing. Trump watched and waited. Rather than increase his offer, he found leverage. A narrow strip of beachfront property lay between Mar-a-Lago and the ocean. It belonged to Jack Massey, a businessman who'd made his fortune building Kentucky Fried Chicken into a national chain. Trump paid Massey $2 million for the land. Then he made an announcement. He intended to build a house on his new beachfront lot. The structure would rise directly in Mar-a-Lago's sightline, blocking the ocean views from the main terraces. Anyone standing on the famous loggia would see Trump's roof instead of the Atlantic. The threat was clear. Mar-a-Lago's most celebrated feature, its unobstructed oceanfront panorama, would be permanently compromised. The estate's value would crater. Other potential buyers vanished. Nobody wanted a historic property with a spite house blocking the scenery. Negotiations resumed under very different circumstances. Trump also understood what the Post Foundation possessed beyond the real estate. The rooms contained furniture, carpets, porcelain, and decorative objects Marjorie had collected over 50 years. Independent appraisers valued these contents at $8 million, nearly half the asking price for the entire property. By December 1985, both parties signed an agreement. The exact final price remains debated. Trump wrote that he paid $5 million for the house and land, plus $3 million for the furnishings. Contemporary reports cited figures ranging up to $10 million total. What matters is that Trump acquired Mar-a-Lago for roughly half its listed value. The antiques and furniture inside may have been worth more than he paid for the real estate. He'd turned the foundation's desperation into one of the most favorable deals of his career. Trump's wife Ivana immediately took charge of restoration. The property had deteriorated significantly during years of minimal maintenance. Contractors descended, roofs were repaired, mechanical systems replaced, gardens were cut back and replanted. The work continued for months and cost millions beyond the purchase price. But Trump had secured something remarkable, a 17-acre oceanfront estate in Palm Beach that had cost over $100 million to build, purchased for approximately $10 million. The land alone, given its location and zoning, was worth multiples of what he'd paid. The question was what to do with it. Trump began using Mar-a-Lago as a private residence and entertaining venue. Business associates flew down, celebrities attended gatherings. The mansion that had stood mostly empty for years was suddenly filled with people again. But the economics remained problematic. Trump was now facing the same costs that had defeated the government and the Post Foundation. Annual maintenance exceeded $3 million. Staff, grounds, utilities. All the expenses continued regardless of how much he used the property. Trump was wealthy, but even for him, carrying Mar-a-Lago as a pure residence was questionable economics. The house consumed money without generating any return. Something had to change. His first idea was subdivision. In 1990, Trump approached the Palm Beach Town Council with a proposal. He wanted to divide the estate into smaller residential lots. The mansion would remain, but the surrounding acreage would be sold to developers. The sales would generate immediate cash while reducing his maintenance burden. The town rejected him. Mar-a-Lago held National Historic Landmark status. Residents who lived nearby had no interest in construction crews and new neighbors disrupting the area. The council told Trump to find another solution. Negotiations stretched over several years. Trump threatened. The town resisted. Finally, in 1993, they reached a compromise. Trump could convert Mar-a-Lago into a private membership club. He would maintain the historic structure and grounds. In exchange, the town would permit limited commercial use. The arrangement gave Trump a revenue stream while preserving the estate. It was a solution nobody had previously considered because it required changing the fundamental nature of what Mar-a-Lago was. No longer a private residence, no longer a government retreat, but a club. The Mar-a-Lago Club opened in 1995. Initiation fees started at $25,000. Annual dues added thousands more. Members gained access to pools, tennis courts, spa facilities, and dining rooms. They could host private events in spaces that had once welcomed presidents. The business model was straightforward. Convert fixed costs into revenue opportunities. The rooms Marjorie built for entertaining would now be rented for events. The grounds she maintained for personal use would now be shared among hundreds of members. The staff required to operate the property would be paid from membership fees rather than from Trump's pocket. But the club distinguished itself in ways beyond location and architecture. Other private clubs in Palm Beach had long maintained restrictive membership policies. Jewish applicants found themselves perpetually waitlisted at certain establishments. African American families were quietly steered elsewhere. The exclusions were rarely written but consistently enforced. Trump took a different approach. The Mar-a-Lago Club accepted members regardless of religion or background. Jewish families joined alongside Protestant dynasties. African American professionals received the same consideration as anyone else. The club reportedly welcomed gay couples when other establishments would not. Whether this represented genuine conviction or business calculation became a matter of debate. Skeptics noted that many wealthy Palm Beach residents were Jewish but had no club of their own. By welcoming them, Trump tapped a market competitors ignored. Supporters argued that challenging local norms required courage regardless of motivation. The results were clear. Membership applications exceeded availability. Revenue from dues and events stabilized the property's finances. By the late 1990s, initiation fees had risen substantially as demand increased. The property that had nearly bankrupted the government was now generating millions in annual revenue. Trump maintained private quarters in a closed-off wing while the rest of the estate operated as a club. He'd solved the problem that defeated everyone else by transforming expenses into income. The burden became an asset. Celebrities performed at Mar-a-Lago. Celine Dion and Billy Joel gave concerts for members. The International Red Cross Ball, the charity event Marjorie Post had hosted for decades, continued under new ownership. The house she built for entertaining had found a sustainable future as a business. By 2000, Trump owned 5 units in addition to his private quarters. The property that everyone said was impossible to maintain was thriving. He'd done what the federal government, the Post Foundation, and every private buyer had failed to do. He'd made Mar-a-Lago work, but this success represented a complete abandonment of Marjorie's vision. She'd built Mar-a-Lago to serve the nation. Trump converted it to serve himself. She'd intended it as a gift. He'd transformed it into a profit center. The legacy she'd carefully planned had been replaced with something entirely different. The question is whether that transformation saved Mar-a-Lago or destroyed what it was meant to be. The answer depends on what you value: preservation or purpose, survival or integrity, the mansion standing or the mission honored. What's certain is that by 2000, Mar-a-Lago bore almost no resemblance to what Marjorie Merriweather Post had envisioned. The Winter White House had become a private club. The National Monument had become a business. The carefully planned legacy had collapsed entirely. And Donald Trump, who'd acquired the property nobody wanted, had created something nobody expected. Mar-a-Lago was no longer Marjorie's palace. It was Trump's. Everything that came next would flow from that transformation, from club to command center. For nearly 20 years, Mar-a-Lago operated as Trump intended, a successful private club generating revenue, hosting events, maintaining the property that everyone said couldn't be maintained. Members paid escalating fees. Celebrities performed. The former estate functioned as a profitable business. Trump's life during this period was complicated. Business ventures succeeded and failed. Marriages ended and began. His public profile fluctuated between celebrity and punchline. But Mar-a-Lago remained constant, a Florida base that provided both personal retreat and commercial income. The property's character evolved under his ownership. Trump added a ballroom in 2005, designed to evoke Versailles. The 20,000-square-foot Donald J. Trump Grand Ballroom cost approximately $40 million. 17 crystal chandeliers, each costing $250,000, hung from gilded ceilings. The addition dwarfed Marjorie's original ballroom and reflected Trump's aesthetic preferences over hers. Critics found the Versailles styling jarring against the Spanish Mediterranean architecture Marjorie and her architects had created. Preservationists questioned whether the addition honored her vision, but the ballroom gave Mar-a-Lago capacity for the largest events in Palm Beach. The International Red Cross Ball moved to the new space. Society events that had gone elsewhere now came to the club. By 2015, Mar-a-Lago had been Trump's property for 3 decades. The estate had transitioned from burden to asset to something approaching monument. It represented his success in ways Trump Tower never quite could. Anyone could build a skyscraper in Manhattan. Acquiring and preserving a historic estate required different skills. Then Trump announced his presidential campaign, and Mar-a-Lago's role changed completely. During the campaign, Mar-a-Lago became an extension of Trump's political operation. Donors were entertained there. Strategy was discussed in rooms Marjorie had built for entirely different purposes. The estate that was supposed to become a winter White House was now serving as the headquarters for a presidential campaign. After the election in November 2016, the transformation accelerated. Trump began spending weekends at Mar-a-Lago with extraordinary frequency. The property he'd converted to a club was now functioning as a presidential retreat. The very purpose Marjorie had envisioned, rejected by the government, was being fulfilled, but under entirely different ownership and circumstances. The media began calling it the Winter White House. Trump encouraged the designation. Mar-a-Lago hosted foreign leaders. Cabinet meetings occurred there. Official business was conducted in a private club. The lines between public and private, between official residence and commercial property, became impossibly blurred. Security challenges immediately became apparent. Unlike Camp David, which was built as a presidential retreat, Mar-a-Lago was a club with hundreds of members. Secret Service had to screen everyone. Motorcades disrupted Palm Beach traffic. The proximity to the ocean created vulnerabilities. The airport noise that had concerned Carter's security advisors in the 1970s remained. The club membership became a controversy unto itself. Anyone who could afford the fees, which Trump had raised to $200,000 for initiation, gained proximity to the president. Members dined where he dined. They attended events where he spoke. Access to power was being sold, critics argued, through club membership. Trump's businesses benefited directly from his presidency. Mar-a-Lago's value increased substantially. Membership became vastly more desirable. The property that had struggled to sell for $20 million in 1985 was now worth exponentially more because the sitting president spent weekends there. The ethical complications were unprecedented. Previous presidents had separated themselves from business interests. Trump refused. He maintained ownership of Mar-a-Lago and continued profiting from it while serving as president. Every weekend visit generated revenue for his club. Every foreign leader entertained there elevated the property's prestige. But setting aside ethics, something remarkable had occurred. The estate that the federal government rejected as unsuitable for presidential use was now being used for exactly that purpose. The Winter White House that failed under government ownership succeeded under private ownership. Marjorie's vision, dismissed as impractical, had been partially realized 4 decades later. The differences were significant. Marjorie had imagined Mar-a-Lago serving the nation. Trump was using it to serve himself. She'd planned to give it away. He'd converted it into an asset. She'd conceived it as a public space. He'd made it private. Then, selectively accessible. Yet the fundamental function she'd envisioned, a Florida retreat where presidents could work and entertain, was happening. The architecture she'd commissioned was hosting exactly the activities she'd imagined. The rooms she'd designed for state dinners were serving that purpose. The irony was complete. Marjorie spent decades planning to give Mar-a-Lago to the government so it could serve as a presidential retreat. The government rejected it. Trump bought it as a real estate deal. Then when Trump became president, Mar-a-Lago finally became what Marjorie always wanted, just under circumstances she never could have predicted. After Trump's presidency ended in January 2021, Mar-a-Lago's role shifted again. No longer the Winter White House, it became Trump's primary residence. The club operations continued. Events were hosted, members still paid their fees, but the property's status had changed fundamentally. Federal documents were stored there. Investigations followed. The estate that hosted presidents became the center of criminal inquiries. Rooms Marjorie designed for entertaining became subjects of search warrants. The property's dual nature, part residence and part club, created legal complications nobody had anticipated. By 2023, Mar-a-Lago had been Trump's property for 38 years. During that time, the estate had served as residence, club, campaign headquarters, presidential retreat, and post-presidential home. It had generated revenue, created controversies, and survived when almost everyone predicted it would fail. But here's what's remarkable. Mar-a-Lago still stands. 1927 to present. Nearly a century of existence. The estate has outlasted the era that built it, outlasted the woman who created it, outlasted every prediction about its fate. Other Gilded Age mansions fell decades ago. The Vanderbilt palaces on Fifth Avenue were demolished in the 1920s and 30s. The Newport cottages became museums because families couldn't afford to maintain them. The great estates that defined American wealth in the early 20th century mostly disappeared. Mar-a-Lago survived. Not because of Marjorie's careful planning, not because the government preserved it, but because Donald Trump saw commercial potential nobody else recognized and was willing to transform it into something its creator never intended. The question is, what that survival means. Is Mar-a-Lago a preservation success? Or is it a betrayal of everything Marjorie Post intended? The mansion stands, but the mission collapsed. The architecture survived, but the legacy failed. Understanding why requires looking at what actually happened to Marjorie's vision and why her carefully constructed plans proved so fragile. Why legacies fail. Marjorie Merriweather Post spent the last decades of her life preparing Mar-a-Lago's future. She worked with lawyers to structure the gift. She established a Trust fund to help with maintenance. She specified exactly how the estate should be used. She did everything wealthy people are supposed to do when planning a legacy. It failed completely. The government rejected the gift. The estate nearly disappeared. Everything she envisioned collapsed. The question is why? The simple answer is money. Operating Mar-a-Lago cost at least $1 million annually in the 1970s. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $5 million today. The trust fund Marjorie provided covered 10% of costs. The government would have needed to spend the rest. For a property that served no essential function, that was politically impossible. But money alone doesn't explain the failure. The government operates facilities far more expensive than Mar-a-Lago, Camp David, Air Force One, the White House itself. Cost isn't prohibitive when there's sufficient justification. The real problem was that Mar-a-Lago solved no problem the government actually had. Presidents already possessed multiple retreats. The White House provided everything needed for winter hosting. Camp David offered secure privacy. Key Biscayne, which Nixon preferred, was equally close to Washington. Adding Mar-a-Lago to the portfolio offered nothing except additional expense and logistical complications. Marjorie had assumed that magnificence created value. If the estate was beautiful enough, grand enough, historically significant enough, surely the nation would want it. The assumption was wrong. Governments don't operate like collectors. They don't acquire properties because they're beautiful. They acquire properties because they're useful. Mar-a-Lago was magnificent, but not useful. That made it worthless to the government regardless of how much Marjorie had spent building it. The second problem was timing. Marjorie died in 1973. This was not 1927. The country had changed fundamentally. The Vietnam War had shattered faith in government. Watergate was destroying Nixon's presidency. The economy was entering stagflation. The social consensus that made Gilded Age estates acceptable had collapsed. Accepting a palace from a serial heiress looked tone-deaf at best, offensive at worst. While millions struggled economically, should taxpayers fund a mansion so presidents could vacation more luxuriously? The optics were terrible. Marjorie had built Mar-a-Lago when such estates seemed normal. She donated it when they seemed obscene. The gift that would have been celebrated in 1930 was rejected in 1973 because America had changed. The third problem was control. Marjorie specified exactly how Mar-a-Lago should be used. Presidential retreat, winter White House, nothing else. The restrictions made the property less flexible, less useful. The government couldn't repurpose it if presidential needs changed. They were stuck with Marjorie's vision or nothing. Ironically, these restrictions meant to preserve her legacy actually destroyed it. If she'd simply given the property to the government without conditions, they might have found alternative uses. A Coast Guard facility, a diplomatic training center, literally anything that justified the expense. But Marjorie's insistence that it serve as a winter White House made the gift unusable when that specific purpose proved unnecessary. The fourth problem was that Marjorie fundamentally misunderstood how legacy works. She believed you could control the future by specifying it in documents. Build something magnificent, create endowments, establish trusts, write detailed instructions, and your vision would be preserved. This is how wealthy people typically think about legacy. Through control mechanisms, through documents and lawyers and carefully constructed institutions. But legacy doesn't work that way. It requires other people to care. And you can't force people to care through legal documents. The government didn't want Mar-a-Lago because nobody in government cared enough about Marjorie's vision to fight for it. There was no constituency demanding the estate be preserved for presidential use. There were only bureaucrats calculating that the costs exceeded any conceivable benefit. Without people who cared, all of Marjorie's careful planning meant nothing. The documents and trusts and specifications were worthless when nobody with power wanted what she was offering. This is the fundamental problem with legacy planning. It assumes rationality and continuity. It assumes future generations will value what you valued. It assumes your vision of the future will align with how the future actually unfolds. These assumptions are almost always wrong. Marjorie built Mar-a-Lago for an America that was already disappearing by the time she finished construction. She planned its future for an America that no longer existed by the time she died. The 46 years between Mar-a-Lago's opening and her death had transformed the country so thoroughly that her gift made no sense. Trump succeeded where Marjorie failed because he didn't try to control the future. He adapted to circumstances. When Mar-a-Lago proved unsustainable as a residence, he converted it to a club. When the club needed additional revenue, he added the ballroom. When he became president, the property's purpose shifted again. Trump was opportunistic where Marjorie was rigid, flexible where she insisted on control. This doesn't make Trump admirable. It makes him successful in ways that don't require being admirable. He saved Mar-a-Lago by abandoning everything Marjorie intended it to be. The mansion survived. The mission died. He chose preservation over purpose. The choice Marjorie never admitted she faced was this. Did she want Mar-a-Lago to survive, or did she want her vision to survive? She assumed both could be preserved together. She was wrong. Saving the building required abandoning the purpose. Trump understood this. Marjorie never did. Never. This explains why wealthy people's legacies fail so consistently. They build institutions meant to last forever, create endowments meant to fund their visions in perpetuity, specify exactly how their wishes should be honored. Then they die, and within a generation, everything transforms into something they never intended. The buildings remain sometimes. The purposes disappear almost always. Because the only legacy you can actually control is what you do while alive. Everything after depends on people who have their own priorities, their own pressures, their own visions that have nothing to do with yours. Marjorie spent decades planning Mar-a-Lago's future. She failed completely. Trump spent 38 years adapting to Mar-a-Lago's reality. He succeeded completely. The difference wasn't vision or generosity or even wealth. It was willingness to let go of how things were supposed to be and accept how they actually were. Mar-a-Lago stands today not because Marjorie's legacy succeeded, but because it failed so thoroughly that someone else could create something different from the ruins. That's not the story wealthy people want to hear about their carefully constructed legacies, but it's almost always the true one. What survives and why. Stand outside Mar-a-Lago today and you see a mansion that's nearly a century old. The Dorian stone has weathered exactly as Marjorie intended. The red tile roofs shelter rooms she designed. The tower still rises over 70 feet, offering views across the island. From the exterior, the estate looks much as it did in 1927, but almost everything else has changed. The 60-person staff Marjorie employed has been replaced by club personnel serving hundreds of members. The private entertaining she hosted has become commercial events anyone can rent. The winter White House she envisioned has transformed into a business generating millions annually. The national monument she planned to create became a private club, then a presidential retreat under private ownership, then the center of criminal investigations. The question is, what actually survived? The answer is complicated. The architecture survived. That's significant. Most Gilded Age mansions didn't make it past mid-century. The economic pressures that made Mar-a-Lago difficult to maintain destroyed nearly every comparable property. Staffing costs, property taxes, maintenance requirements, the same forces that worried the government and the Post Foundation have demolished dozens of estates. Mar-a-Lago still stands because Trump found a business model that worked. Converting the estate to a club transformed fixed costs into variable revenue. Members paid for the privilege of accessing what Marjorie built. The more members, the more revenue. The model scaled in ways pure residential use never could. This suggests something important about preservation. Buildings survive not because they're beautiful or historically significant, but because someone finds a way to make them economically sustainable. Beauty and history matter for attracting people willing to pay, but without a viable business model, even the most magnificent architecture disappears. Trump didn't save Mar-a-Lago because he appreciated Marjorie's vision. He saved it because he saw a way to profit. The motivation was commercial, not preservationist, but the effect was preservation. Sometimes the right outcome happens for the wrong reasons. What didn't survive was everything Marjorie considered essential: the purpose, the mission, the carefully planned legacy. She'd built Mar-a-Lago to serve the nation. It serves Trump's interests. She'd intended it as a gift demonstrating American achievement. It became a business demonstrating Trump's deal-making. She'd specified it should be a presidential retreat owned by the government. It became a presidential retreat owned privately, used when convenient, monetized constantly. Every element of Marjorie's vision that mattered more than architecture failed completely. The question is whether that matters. If the building survives but the purpose dies, is that preservation or betrayal? The answer depends on what you believe is worth saving. Preservationists generally argue that buildings themselves matter most. Once a significant structure is lost, it's gone forever. The original purpose can evolve. New uses can be found, but the architecture, if destroyed, can never be recreated. By that standard, Trump saved Mar-a-Lago. The estate exists. People can experience what Marjorie built. That's success. Historians might argue differently. A building's significance comes partly from its purpose, its role in history, its meaning beyond physical form. Mar-a-Lago was significant because it represented Gilded Age ambition, because Marjorie intended it as a national monument, because it embodied particular values about wealth and public service. When those meanings disappeared, the building became just an expensive structure. preserved but emptied of significance. The truth is probably that both perspectives are valid. Mar-a-Lago's survival is legitimately impressive. Against all odds, the estate still functions nearly a century after construction. Millions of dollars in annual maintenance get paid. The property is preserved at a high standard. That matters. But Marjorie's legacy did collapse completely. Her vision failed. Her careful planning proved worthless. The purpose she considered essential vanished. That matters too. What Mar-a-Lago's story reveals is how little control wealthy people actually have over their legacies. Marjorie was one of the richest women in America. She owned a fortune, employed armies of lawyers, spent decades planning. None of it mattered. Her vision died because the world changed in ways she couldn't anticipate and wouldn't have accepted. Trump succeeded not because he was wiser or more capable, but because he was willing to adapt. When circumstances changed, he changed. With them. When the original purpose proved unworkable, he invented a new one. Flexibility defeated careful planning. Opportunism defeated vision. This doesn't mean planning is worthless. Mar-a-Lago's quality construction, its solid foundation, its thoughtful design, all resulted from Marjorie's careful attention. Those elements made the estate worth preserving when Trump encountered it. Without that underlying quality, the property would have been demolished regardless of any business model. But planning can only address physical elements. Materials, construction, design, these respond to specifications and money. Purpose, meaning, legacy, these require other people to share your vision, and you can't force that through documents or endowments. The buildings that survive do so because someone in each generation finds reason to preserve them. Sometimes that reason aligns with the builder's intent. Usually it doesn't. Marjorie built Mar-a-Lago as a national monument. Trump preserved it as a business. The building survived. The mission transformed. Both things are true simultaneously. As for Mar-a-Lago's future, that depends on forces beyond anyone's current control. The estate functions now as a club and Trump's residence. When Trump dies, new decisions will be required. His children might continue operating it as a business. They might sell it. The property might face the same economic pressures that threatened it in the 1980s. Or it might transition to yet another purpose nobody currently imagines. What's certain is that whatever happens will be determined by circumstances of that moment, not by plans made today. The building will survive if someone finds it economically viable. The mission will be whatever that person decides. The legacy will be written by forces that can't be controlled or predicted. Marjorie learned that, the hard way, the expensive way, the way that destroyed everything she'd carefully planned. Her palace survived. Her vision didn't. That's the truth about legacy. The stone outlasts the intention. The rooms remain after the purpose departs. The building stands while the meaning collapses. Mar-a-Lago is Marjorie's monument, but it's Trump's property. It was supposed to serve America. Instead, it served private interests. The gift was rejected. The backup plan failed. The building survived because someone saw opportunity where she saw obligation. That's not the story Marjorie wanted. It's not the legacy she planned, but it's the reality she couldn't control. And a century from now, when the current controversies are history, when Trump is as distant as Marjorie is today, Mar-a-Lago will likely still stand. Different purpose, different ownership, different meaning, but standing. Because buildings survive, visions don't. That's the lesson Mar-a-Lago teaches. The uncomfortable, undeniable lesson that wealthy people spend fortunes trying to avoid learning. You can build magnificently. You can plan carefully. You can specify precisely, and none of it determines what happens after you're gone. The palace that Marjorie Merriweather Post built still stands on that barrier island in Palm Beach. 17 acres from ocean to lake, 126 rooms, the same Dorian stone weathered to perfection, the same red tiles sheltering the same rooms where she once entertained presidents. But it's not her palace anymore. It hasn't been for half a century. The gift failed. The legacy collapsed. The careful plans proved worthless. Everything she intended disappeared except the building itself. That building stands today because someone was willing to betray every element of her vision except physical preservation. Trump saved Mar-a-Lago by transforming it into something Marjorie would have hated. The Winter White House became a private club. The National Monument became a business. The gift to America became an asset generating private profit. Is that a preservation success? Or a legacy failure? Both answers are correct simultaneously. The architecture survived. The purpose died. The building was saved. The mission was abandoned. Marjorie spent decades and millions planning a future that never happened. Trump spent decades adapting to circumstances as they emerged. She failed completely. He succeeded completely, not because he was better or wiser, but because he was willing to accept reality instead of trying to control it. The story of Mar-a-Lago is really the story of how power and wealth actually work in America. Not the fairy tale version wealthy people tell themselves, where careful planning and generous giving ensure lasting legacy. The real version, where circumstances change, where people act from self-interest, where magnificent buildings survive while the visions that created them disappear entirely. Marjorie built for permanence. She got survival. Not the same thing. Never the same thing. That's what makes Mar-a-Lago's story so instructive. It reveals the gap between what we build for and what actually lasts, between our intentions and everyone else's interests, between the legacy we plan and the legacy we get. The palace still stands, magnificent, weathered, nearly a century old, a monument to ambition, to wealth, to the belief that you can control the future if you just plan carefully enough, and a monument to the reality that you can't. Marjorie's careful plans collapsed. Trump's opportunistic adaptation succeeded. The building survived. The meaning transformed. The legacy failed, except for the part that always survives: the stone, the rooms, the architecture itself. Everything else, the purpose and the vision and the carefully specified future, all of it disappeared like morning fog. That's the truth about legacy. The uncomfortable truth wealthy people spend fortunes avoiding. You build magnificently, you plan carefully, and then you die. And whatever happens next has almost nothing to do with what you intended. Mar-a-Lago stands today as proof of exactly that truth. A palace that survived by becoming something its builder never imagined. A legacy that collapsed while the building endured. An American monument that tells a story about power and wealth and legacy that nobody planned to tell. The question isn't whether Mar-a-Lago will survive another century. It probably will. Someone will always find economic value in 17 oceanfront acres and a magnificent mansion. The question is what it will mean, what purpose it will serve, whose vision it will represent. That answer is unknowable today, just as Marjorie's plans proved worthless predictions of what actually happened. Buildings survive, meanings change. Legacies transform into something their creators never intended. That's the pattern. That's the truth. That's what Mar-a-Lago's century of existence proves beyond any doubt. The palace stands. The vision failed. Both things are true. Both things matter. And both things will remain true long after current controversies fade into history.